brought to you by MuleSoft, provider of the industry-leading Anypoint platform for APIs.
My name is Adam Duvander, and I'm from Orchestrate, which is a database API, and I spent a few years at ProgrammableWeb as well. And so I'm going to talk about some API adoption strategies, things I noticed from watching thousands of APIs and have seen a bit from the inside as well. And as you saw on your program, it says top 5 API adoption strategies. I thought maybe that I might have a 6th for you today. Is that exciting? But I'm going to let you decide whether it's 5 or 6. So the new title here today is 5 or 6 API adoption strategies. So consider your typical developer. That's probably a junior developer, I think. But your typical developer is going to be interacting with APIs, perhaps Orchestrate for a database, certainly something in the cloud, maybe social login. And then in addition to that, these days, very commonly, also their own services, interacting with those services the same way they do with other APIs. So who here, show of hands, interacts with external APIs within your applications? There we go. We're at APICon. That makes sense, right? There was a maybe. How about interacts with your own APIs? And of those, are any of those public already? So those are some public APIs. So we all know that this is sort of the way that developers have been interacting with applications. This is the change that has happened over the last few years as APIs have become more prevalent. So I want to talk about another typical developer. This guy's name is Chris Jason. He works at ESPN. And he was a web developer at ESPN and was having to build things they did not have APIs, having to build things from XML feeds, scraping things together just to try to create these websites. And ESPN, a whole bunch of different types of sports, there's a lot to it. So this is just Major League Baseball. Not a great example probably for the UK audience, but you can see there's a lot, even just to Major League Baseball. Lots of blue links. Everywhere there is a new feature, something that's needing to pull data. And you can see along the top they've got that across for every sport. So it's a major problem. Then you figure that ESPN actually goes back quite a ways. This was the first ESPN website, which launched in 1995. So they've got a lot of this data that goes back, and so he was having to create this and realized APIs are the obvious solution. He championed it within the company, and to where they then had APIs that were being able to be used and eventually made public. So I imagine that for some of you who are within companies, you're having to be that champion. And perhaps that's why you're here in this room, because the next step after that, right, you have that API, then what do you do to get someone to use it? And so there are a lot of things that typically you might see done. Maybe, hey, let's throw a hackathon. It's not a terrible idea. Let's put it up on Hacker News and see who signs up for it. Maybe. Let's create some AdWords. Maybe also. Those are all fine things, but not necessarily the going to have the maximum impact. Let's actually, in thinking about a hackathon, let's imagine a non-technical example. Say you're a manufacturer of a hammer and you want to increase adoption of your hammer. Would it make sense to say, hey, everyone, come out, bring your wood, and we'll supply the hammers and maybe some coffee, And at the end of a weekend, you'll have your 48-hour house, right? It's maybe a good way to get an understanding of how the hammer works, or some feedback perhaps on the grip or something. But it's not, the house that's built is probably not going to be something that makes a long-term difference. So I think a better question to ask is why you need the developers. You want developers to come and use it, but why do you need them? And so I recommend, if you're in a large organization, looking to some other departments in your organization that might actually be able to help you answer the why and help you figure out how. Talk to the sales department, business development, and marketing. These are things that that developers typically might not think about if you're strictly thinking about, from an engineering perspective. And if you're in a small startup, these are still things that you're needing to do. The things that departments in large organizations do, you're needing to do these as well. And then there are some areas that really need champions, ones where you might be the champion. The community, interacting with the developer community. And then open source. So these are the 6. But I know that in a crowd of technical people, you probably have counted, and especially since I talked about 5 or 6 at the beginning, you might notice that there are only 5 there. So I will discuss the 6th now. It is the one that has perhaps the highest percentage rate of success. So probably now would be the time, if you're taking notes, now would be the time to write down this one. So create a service that is popular. All right, do I need to give you time to write that down? Without a doubt, the most likely way to increase API adoption is to create a service that's popular. So now we're in London, sort of a pub culture here, so I feel like I need to put it in terms of beer. API is the foundation for a service. It's the tabletop, and the service itself is the beer. And the better your beer, the more likely a developer is going to come to your table. And that certainly has been the case for these companies. If you have a popular service, you don't really have to be concerned about your API being popular. Your API will get adopted if the service is popular. But for the rest of us, we have the other 5 that we can talk about. So business development. Business development, partnerships, about connecting people together. And one API provider that I talked to in my time at ProgrammableWeb really changed the way I thought about this. AccuWeather said that their approach to their API is partner first, not ecosystem first. And I'm a developer. I love the open and public API approach. So I'm totally an ecosystem person. But hearing the way that they approached it and how it helps their business to think about who can benefit from the API they have, as opposed to being widely available and kind of hoping that bubbles up. And part of that is thinking about customers in common. So if you have a customer and they're also my customer, it makes sense for us to interact, for us to be able to be integrated together, to be partners, to have our services speak to each other. And this was actually formalized in a group called the Small Business Web, which is a consortium of services that are oriented toward small businesses. So it's actually in their manifesto that members of the Small Business Web have APIs and that they integrate with each other's solutions. And it's not just something they do because it's in the manifesto. It actually has shown to help their businesses. So FreshBooks, which was one of the founders of the small business web, they saw that if someone uses even one integration, in other words, if someone uses an app that's built on top of the FreshBooks API, that customer is 3 times more likely to go from a free account. So FreshBooks has a pretty standard freemium approach, right? They convert from that free account to a paid account simply by having used one integration, which means that if you make those partnerships and make sure that there are integrations there that are useful, then that will help the actual service. Another way of finding partnerships is to put your API in add-in marketplaces like Heroku's add-in marketplace. Have it be in front of those potential customers in common. So a lot of times, it's great if we have a customer in common, but if I don't have customers yet, but you have a place where I might be able to find someone who needs what I have, if it complements what you have, being able to find places to put yourself in front of those potential customers in common. So via add-in marketplaces, other ways, other places where someone who might be interested in what you have is. And then scouting developers. So this, as a biz dev tactic, might feel a little bit more like sales, but the example of this is sort of what AccuWeather does. So they say, okay, who could use weather data in their application? And then go and find someone who has created an app that needs that weather data and encourage them to use it. This quote from Retailagents really stuck with me as well. And that is, they found out that if a developer hadn't already launched an app, the chance of them not only getting it launched, but then making a difference to Retailagents was slim. So instead, Retailagents scouts developers. They try to find developers who could use what they have. They go partner first, not ecosystem first, and find those developers that could really benefit from what they have. And these developers have already have some kind of service that could benefit. ESPN is another great example, and they actually just last month took down their public API. And so you might wonder, well, why am I still showing them here in this example? It's because I think it even makes more sense, the approach that they took, this partner-first approach. They had a publicly available API, but even when they did, you can see these check marks that some things were not available publicly, yet they still were open about what wasn't open. So like the Olympic medals API, only available to strategic partners. But a potential strategic partner might end up on their site, and knowing that that's available is a key piece of information. And so even though you might take a partner-first approach, having some kind of ecosystem where you can then expose this can be beneficial. So the second area, the second department in a large organization, the second hat you might have to wear if you're a small organization, is sales. And my first example for this, I think, might shock you. It shocked me when I saw it in my slide deck. Twilio. Twilio normally would be a great example of an ecosystem-driven API. I mean, they put pricing front and center. The API docs are available. Sign up for free. Everything wide open. And a few years ago, I was watching the founder, Jeff Lawson, give a talk at GlueCon, and he showed this slide, and I said, yeah, that makes sense. They find the developers however they find them. They come in, they sign up, they pay. Fully self-service this was the Twilio that I had known. And then he shocked me with that slide after, that Twilio has a sales team, and that they, in addition to that ecosystem-driven approach, they have a more traditional sales-driven approach. So, assuming that you have a sales department or have someone who will act as that, what is it that salespeople want? Anyone? I put this up one time and someone said coffee. Okay, yeah. Yes, coffee is for closers. So sales wants leads, and one place that you can find those, if you have an API that lets people sign up and kick the tires, there is one source of leads right there. If you have kind of a SaaS model, these are the most common ways of charging for an API, if you charge for an API. So pay as you go, like Twilio has, or a traditional SaaS kind of tiered model, or the kind of freemium approach, which is actually the most popular option. So looking and seeing where your users are in this process and helping bump them up, a great source of leads. I put AdWords with a question mark before. Certainly, that's, paid models could get people in, but the most likely source for those leads are going to be from this third area, this third hat that you might wear, which is the marketing hat. And developer marketing is kind of a strange term. It almost feels like it shouldn't even exist as a term, right? Like developers sort of bristle at the idea of marketing, and that was the case for me as a developer as well. But I think that the way you approach it with developers might be slightly different. You want to help them understand a problem. At ProgrammableWeb, I would see a lot of press releases that looked a lot like this. So Sumco is proud to announce major update, blah, 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 right? Like all about the new feature, the new thing. And I would have to look at these every day and attempt to make a story out of it. Mark is smiling because he understands, because he's going through this now at ProgrammableWeb. How do you try to figure out what it is that's behind this? And so here, this headline might be something more like how to divide by zero, right? Something that actually would be interesting to a developer to read. Well, I think that as API providers, we can do the same thing. We don't have to have the boring announcement. We can go with the much more interesting approach that actually solves the developer problem. And so what I say for being able to do that developer marketing is actually sharing knowledge, not sharing features. So don't tell someone that this particular thing is announced. Instead, explain what it means to them. Explain how they could use it. So I was at SendGrid for a little over a year, and these are a couple of the headlines that I'm particularly proud of where SendGrid shared knowledge and not features. This post was essentially announcing that SendGrid was going to be using Go, the language, moving forward. And rather than saying, we're now using Go, the co-founder wrote about how to convince your company to go with Golang. And similarly, when SendGrid open sourced their documentation, we wrote why we open sourced it. Why is it important? Not that it happened. As developers, what do you think is the most important piece of providing an API to someone, of showing them an API? Anyone say documentation? I'll show you in a minute that you actually do say documentation. So documentation is most of your marketing when marketing an API, when marketing to developers, because that's what they're actually going to use to integrate. And so this is where it sort of diverges a little bit from that traditional marketing. If you're a developer within a large organization, your marketing department can help you, but you can also help your marketing department to speak developer. And part of that is making sure that documentation is great and accessible. And I think Stripe is a great example of that. There was a survey of developers a couple years ago, and they were asked the most important factors in an API. And you can see there right at the top, complete and accurate documentation, the absolute highest. In fact, reading this, what I see is that documentation for an API is more important than the API actually being available. Just by a hair, but still, people value more that an API is documented than an API can actually be reached. So if you need any more ammo to explain the importance of documentation of your API within your organization, there it is right there. Other things that I consider to be documentation, not just the API reference, just the facts sort of stuff, but tutorials, things that actually walk a developer through building something. Again, so many companies launch APIs and then wonder why developers don't use it. And they might say something like, well, we don't want to give examples and sample apps, right? We don't want to hold back their imagination. We want to see what's built. But you have to kind of steer developers, inspire them in a particular direction. And tutorials and sample apps can do that. And not only show them what's possible, but show them how to do it using your API. And then similarly, client libraries are documentation. These are SDKs, right? Things that are built and language ready. They're in a popular language that the developer already uses and they can plug right in. So that brings us to the fourth, and perhaps one that maybe feels the most like what you would expect developer adoption to be, and that is community. Community, a group of people, specifically a group of people that you want to interact with your API, and so you need to find them. And you can find them in a couple of places. You can find them online, find them on Twitter, not necessarily talking about you, but how about talking about the problem that your API solves? You might find them on Stack Overflow, similar approach there. Hacker News, maybe. But offline is important. I don't have to tell that to a group of people who are spending their day at an event like this. But yes, go to an event like APICon. Go to meetups. And yes, even hackathons. Hackathons can be great ways to get product feedback, to get the word out, and find individual developers. It's definitely a one-to-one kind of approach. And then open source as a way to gain API adoption. One is to contribute to what you use. So again, this is from that Golang post. And the SendGrid co-founder, Tim Jenkins, in choosing Go, they realized that there was some library support that wasn't as strong as other languages. But he decided that they would flip that around and they would contribute back what they had to build in order to build up that community. And you can certainly see examples of companies who've open sourced their entire product or who created companies out of open source products. Then you could integrate your product with open source by creating plugins like WordPress plugins or e-commerce plugins, add-ons. But the important thing here is to always, within open source, make sure that you're thinking of the community good. So you're not building an open source product that then requires that everyone pay for your service, right? You want to be helping those who are already using your service, helping them solve a specific problem. And open sourcing all you can within your own product, within your own service. Certainly the client libraries that you build on top of your API, you want to have open source and be welcoming of contributions. You could open source your documentation. And depending on your business, you may even be able to open source your secret sauce, because your use of the secret sauce is certainly going to be better than someone else's, right? So having it out there. So those are the 5 or 6 ways that you can increase API adoption, and you want to have as many of these as you can, so that you can kind of someone latches onto one and that pulls them into kind of your gravitational pull, and maybe makes you a little bit dizzy while you're at it. So those are the 5 or 6. Thank you all very much. Those who are too bashful to ask, I'll be around here as well as out at the Orchestrate booth. And thanks a bunch. All right.
Brought to you by MuleSoft, provider of the industry-leading AnyPoint platform for APIs.